Imagine this. You are floating in the dark silence of space, almost 400,000 kilometers away from Earth. All around you there is only black emptiness. Far below, the blue Earth appears like a small, shining ball. There are cities there, people, voices, life. But here there is only silence. A silence so deep that even the sound of your own breathing begins to create fear. April 1970. At Kennedy Space Center in Florida, thousands of people were looking toward the sky. The sun was shining, but everyone's eyes were fixed on the massive rocket standing on the launch pad. This was not an ordinary rocket. This was Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built by humans at that time. Inside it, 3 humans were sitting: Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, Fred Haise. All 3 were sitting calmly, but their heartbeats were fast. This was their dream, to go to the moon, to see a new world up close. The countdown had begun. T-10, 9, 8. Smoke began to come out from beneath the rocket. 7, 6, 5. The engines slowly started roaring. 4, 3, 2, 1. Suddenly the Earth began to shake. With a tremendous roar, Saturn V began rising toward the sky. Flames were spreading downward, and the massive rocket, weighing thousands of tons, was slowly leaving the ground. Within seconds, its speed started increasing. Inside, the 3 astronauts were pressed into their seats. Heavy vibrations could be felt throughout the spacecraft. But after a few minutes, the vibrations became less. The pull of gravity began to loosen, and then suddenly everything became quiet. They had reached space. Jim Lovell looked out of the window. The Earth was slowly becoming smaller. The blue ocean, white clouds, and continents, together they looked like a beautiful round ball. He smiled softly. "Look, home looks so beautiful." Jack Swigert laughed and said, "And we are moving away from it." A light laughter echoed between them. The next 2 days of the mission went completely normal. They checked instruments, talked with Earth, and recorded views with the camera. Sometimes they even joked. Fred Haise looked at the camera and said, "If you people were here, you would understand how strange it feels to float in space." He slowly rotated in the air. People on Earth were watching all this on television screens. Everything was going according to plan. But there is one truth about space: it is never completely safe. It was the night of the 3rd day. The spacecraft was moving rapidly toward the moon. Inside there was dim light. The soft sounds of machines could be heard. Jack Swigert was sitting in front of the control panel. A message came from Earth. "Stir oxygen tank number 2 and check its reading." It was a normal procedure. Swigert moved his hand toward the switch. He pressed the button. 1 second, 2 seconds, and then suddenly, boom! A loud explosion occurred. The entire spacecraft shook. Lights started flickering. Alarms began ringing. All 3 astronauts jerked in their seats. What was that? Jim Lovell leaned toward the window. Something white could be seen spreading into space outside. "Gas is escaping," Fred Haise said in panic. "Our oxygen is leaking." Red lights were glowing on the control panel. One by one, systems began failing. Jack Swigert immediately picked up the microphone. His voice was slightly shaking. "Houston, we have a problem." A sudden silence spread in the control room on Earth. "Repeat that?" Looking outside the window, Jim Lovell said, "Houston, we heard a big explosion, and it looks like our oxygen tank has failed." Engineers sitting in the control room immediately looked at their screens. The data was changing rapidly. Oxygen levels were dropping. Electric power was decreasing.
Someone said quietly, "This is not a good sign." The situation in space was getting worse rapidly. The main part of the spacecraft from which they were supposed to return to Earth was no longer safe. Jim Lovell said slowly, "If the oxygen runs out, we won't stay alive for long." Inside the spacecraft, the temperature was starting to fall. The sounds of machines were becoming weaker, and outside, the endless darkness of space. Jack Swigert looked out through the window. Now it looked even smaller than before, so far away that even help reaching from there could take several days, and they probably did not even have that much time. The alarms inside the spacecraft were still ringing, but this time it was not just a warning from machines. It was the beginning of a long battle between life and death.
In the dark silence of space, the spacecraft was still moving forward, but now it was no longer the same as before. The explosion that had happened a short time ago had changed everything. Red warning lights were flashing across the control panel. The sound of alarms echoed through the cabin. Jack Swigert looked at the screen. The oxygen level was dropping rapidly. He said nervously, "Jim, if it keeps falling like this, we don't have much time." Jim Lovell tried to stay calm, but the concern on his face was clear. He looked out the window. Far out in space, a white cloud of gas was spreading. That was the same oxygen that, until a few moments ago, had been their lifeline. Fred Hayes said slowly, "We're losing our oxygen to space." Inside the spacecraft, the temperature had started to fall. To save electricity, many systems had to be shut down. The lights grew dim. Even the sound of the machines had become quieter. Back on Earth, dozens of scientists stood in mission control, staring at their screens. Everyone was analyzing the incoming data. The situation was changing every second. One engineer said anxiously, "Oxygen tank number 2 is almost empty, and tank number 1 is unstable." Silence filled the room. If both tanks failed, the spacecraft would lose electrical power, and without electricity, navigation, communication, and life support systems would all shut down. Jim Lovell picked up the radio. "Houston, tell us what you want us to do." For a few seconds, only static could be heard over the radio. Then a voice came from Earth. "Apollo 13, we believe the command module will not remain safe. You will need to move into the lunar module." Fred Hayes looked at Jim in surprise. The lunar module? The small craft that had been designed only for landing on the moon. It had been built for just 2 astronauts and only for a few hours of operation. But now, 3 men would have to survive inside it for several days. Jack Swigert said quietly, "So, that's our lifeboat." The 3 astronauts quickly gathered essential equipment and moved into the lunar module. The space inside was extremely tight. Narrow walls, limited instruments, and very little energy available. As soon as they entered, they began activating its systems. But the problems did not end there. Jim noticed that the electrical power was being used very quickly. He immediately ordered, "Shut down every non-essential system." One by one, the lights were turned off. Now only the faint glow of a few instruments remained inside the cabin. The cold of space slowly began creeping inside. Within a few hours, the temperature dropped significantly. Fred Hayes rubbed his hands and said, "It's getting really cold in here." Their breath could now be seen like mist in the air, but the real danger had not appeared yet. A little while later, Jack Swigert noticed another reading. His eyebrows tightened. "Jim, the carbon dioxide level is rising." If carbon dioxide levels rise too much, a person slowly becomes unconscious, and then breathing becomes impossible. Jim Lovell immediately contacted Earth. "Houston, we have another problem." Scientists in mission control quickly began calculating. After a few moments, one engineer said, "The lunar module filters are not designed to support 3 people for this long." Once again, silence filled the room. Someone quietly said,
If the carbon dioxide keeps rising, they could fall asleep and never wake up. But giving up was not an option. Scientists immediately began searching for a solution. They placed the same equipment on their table that the astronauts had on board: plastic bags, cardboard, tape, and a few tubes. For hours they experimented. Finally, one engineer said, "Maybe this could work." An improvised filter was designed. Now the challenge was teaching the astronauts in space how to build it. Jim Lovell sat in front of the radio. Instructions began coming from Earth. Take a plastic bag, connect it with the pipe, then seal the cardboard with tape. The three astronauts carefully followed every step. Their hands were shaking from the cold, but after some time, the filter was ready. They connected it to the system. A few seconds passed, then a few minutes. Jack Swigert looked at the screen. The carbon dioxide levels slowly began to fall. Fred Hayes let out a deep breath. "It's working." Back on Earth, people in mission control also felt a wave of relief. But their journey was far from over. Another challenge still remained. The spacecraft was no longer traveling in the correct direction. If it was not redirected at the right moment, it could drift endlessly through space. The navigation computer had also been shut down. Now they would have to rely only on their eyes and the stars to guide their path. Jim Lovell looked out the window. Far away, the moon could be seen, a cold, silent world of rock, and behind it, somewhere in the distance, Earth. Jim spoke quietly. "If we use the moon's gravity correctly, we might be able to swing around and head back home." Jack Swigert asked, "And if the calculation is wrong?" For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Jim answered calmly, "Then we'll be lost in space forever." The spacecraft was slowly approaching the moon. The view outside was breathtaking, but they had no time to admire it. Everything now depended on a small engine burn. Just a few seconds of firing the engine, at the right time, in the right direction. If it lasted even 1 second too long, the path would change. If it was too short, they might never reach Earth. Jim Lovell grabbed the controls. Jack Swigert watched the timer. Fred Hayes stared out the window to guide their direction. Their breathing was heavy. Jim said quietly, "Get ready." And at that moment, in the deep silence of space, a small engine was about to fire, one that would decide whether they would return home or disappear forever into the endless darkness of space.
In the deep silence of space, the three astronauts were now standing in a point where only two possibilities existed. Either they would find their way back home, or they would disappear forever into the endless darkness of space. The spacecraft was slowly approaching the moon. Through the window, the surface of the moon had started to appear, gray, covered with craters, completely silent and lifeless. But inside the spacecraft, the atmosphere was very different. Jim Lovell was holding the controls. Jack Swigert was staring at the timer. Fred Hayes was looking out the window, using the stars and the moon's position to guide their direction. The navigation computer was shut down. Now they had to rely only on their eyes and their experience. Jim said quietly, "Jack, start the timer when I tell you." Jack replied, "Got it." The spacecraft was now under the gravitational influence of the moon. If the engine fired at the right moment, they could swing around the moon and head back toward Earth. But if even 1 second went wrong, their path could change forever. Jim took a deep breath. "Ready?" Fred looked out the window and said, "Direction is good." Jack placed his finger on the timer. "Now!" Jim fired the engine. The spacecraft vibrated slightly. The small engine began burning in the silence of space. There was no loud sound, only a faint vibration. Jack started counting loudly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Jim focused entirely on keeping the direction steady. 5, 6, 7. Fred continued watching the view outside to guide them. 8, 9, 10. "Stop,"
Jim immediately shut the engine off. For a few seconds, silence filled the cabin. The three astronauts looked at each other. Now everything depended on the calculations. A few minutes later, a voice came over the radio from Earth. "Apollo 13, your trajectory is correct. You are heading back toward Earth." All three men let out a deep breath of relief. But their real test was still not over. For the next several days, they had to survive inside that tiny lunar module. The temperature had dropped even more. Inside the cabin, it felt almost like ice. Small droplets of water had started freezing on the walls. The astronauts sat tightly inside their suits, trying to keep warm. Very little water remained. Food was limited. But the hardest thing was the waiting. The days passed slowly. Sometimes they looked out the window at Earth. Now it appeared slightly larger than before. That same blue planet, the place they called home. On the fourth day, the spacecraft was finally approaching Earth. Now the most dangerous stage of the journey was about to begin, re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. If the angle was even slightly wrong, the capsule could burn up, and if the angle was too shallow, it could bounce back into space. Jim Lovell said calmly, "Guys, everything depends on this final stage." The blue sphere of Earth now filled the window. The spacecraft slowly moved toward the atmosphere. As soon as it entered Earth's atmosphere, radio communication would be completely lost for a few minutes. This period was known as blackout. But this time, those few minutes would feel like the longest minutes in the world. The spacecraft began plunging toward Earth at tremendous speed. Friction with the atmosphere created intense heat. Flames began forming around the capsule. A glowing layer of plasma surrounded it. And suddenly, radio contact was lost. In mission control on Earth, complete silence filled the room. Everyone stared at the screens. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. No one knew what was happening inside. Was the capsule still intact? Were the astronauts still alive? 4 minutes, 5 minutes. An engineer in mission control whispered, "They should have responded by now." The tension in the room grew stronger. And then, a faint voice came through the radio. "Houston, do you read us?" Suddenly, the entire control room came alive. "Apollo 13, we hear you loud and clear." A few seconds later, the parachutes deployed. 3 giant red and white parachutes opened in the sky. The capsule slowly descended. Below them, the deep blue waters of the Pacific Ocean were shining. And then, splash! The capsule landed safely in the ocean. Within minutes, rescue helicopters arrived. The hatch was opened. Inside were 3 exhausted but smiling faces. Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. They were alive. The mission had not landed on the moon, but it became one of the greatest survival stories in the history of space exploration. Because on that day, 3 men showed the world that when hope stays alive, even the most dangerous journey through space can still lead you back home. If you enjoyed this real space story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for more incredible and thrilling stories from space.